Welcome to the Ellis Talker Show. If you enjoy our content, please like or subscribe.
Hi, welcome to the Ellis Talker Show. I'm DV LeBron. Do you have any construction needs? Maybe you want to, build a new kitchen. That kitchen is just bad and you want to do something with it. Check out K&H Construction in Waxahachie, Chris Helms. He'll take care of you. Let him know DV LeBron sent you. So there is a epidemic, a major problem happening in the U.S. with abuse of special needs kids. I know you've seen the news reports from different places throughout the Metroplex and even close to home. Recently, there was an issue at Waxahachie ISD. There was issues at MISD where kids were put in holds, or there was issues with that. And the Department of Education says that at least 100,000 kids a year are put in these restraints, isolated. And there are studies that's come out that are talking about the very negative effects of this. So I wanted to have my special guest, Mr. Charles Bell, doctor at Illinois State.
Yes.
Illinois State, a doctor and also an author of No Restraints, Disabled Children and Institutionalized Violence in Schools. Dr. Bell, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's a big problem, and I've talked with Guy, and I've had him on the show, Guy with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraints, and it is a huge problem happening all over the country. And I hear the other sides where the teachers are getting assaulted, and the teachers don't know what to do in there, and there's so many different angles to this. Somebody who's autistic and the world is different to them. The world they process is different to them. And so things like being held down can be much more traumatic than an average kid. So I wanted you to kind of speak on the things you've done, because you've done research on this. So, Doctor, can you kind of give a brief intro on you, and we'll kind of dive in?
Yes, certainly. My name is Dr. Charles Bell. I'm a criminal justice professor at Illinois State University, and I specialize in school punishment, understanding how school punishment impacts students, families, and school staff. I think it's really important to understand the family's perspective. I think a lot of times parents are ignored. No one comes to the parents and actually asks them about their experiences. So I think it's very important. Parents are enrolling their children or withdrawing their children from schools throughout the nation. And we need to know what's going on in the schools and why they're leaving, and how school punishment is impacting students' grades, their feelings about school, their mental health, and things of that nature. So that's one of the things that I do is I go in, I recruit students, recruit families, and learn about school punishment and how it impacts families. And while a lot of my early work focused on school suspensions, my most recent work focuses on school seclusion and restraints, which is an understudied social problem in our society, but very important.
You saw in your work with No Suspension in that book, when you were doing the research, and I heard you say this in another podcast, you kind of stumbled onto this problem and you saw just the enormity of it and ended up writing a book. Is that right?
Yes.
Wow. I mean, it is, you use things, there was a phrase that you used on the title where you use institutionalized violence. That's strong language. Tell me
Yes.
what justifies that? What have you seen in your studies that would justify that?
Yeah. So when you look at the state laws around school seclusion and restraint, and particularly the reporting mechanisms, parents are supposed to be notified in most states, nearly all of them, within a timely manner. And that's usually the language they use, within a day or two, if not immediately, when a restraint or seclusion is used. And state after state, I've talked to parents who told me that they received, not only did they not receive any notification that their children were being restrained or secluded, but states are actually using this innocent language on the surface to mask what was actually going on in the school. So instead of calling school seclusion what it was, they're calling it timeout. They're calling it calm down room or quiet room. On the surface, it seems very minor, but I want you to really just take a second and really think about when you receive a notice telling you that your child is in timeout, what comes to mind? Well, you're thinking about a child who's in the corner of a room, who's sitting in a desk, who had maybe some minor misbehavior. You're not thinking of a child who's in a jail like seclusion room that looks like solitary confinement. That's what you're not thinking. You're not thinking of a child who's being dragged down the hall. So these terms, calm down room, quiet room, they look innocent, but what they are is really violent. These are terms that hide and conceal what's going on in a school so that parents have no idea what's going on with their own children. And the intentionality behind this to hide what's going on with the child and prevent the parent from knowing about it, prevent the state government and the federal government from knowing about it, because a lot of these states were not even reporting to the Office of Civil Rights Investigations because they weren't getting the data from their school districts. So it's important just to understand that this was all an institution, a school that's lying to parents, hiding things from the government, and that's violence in this case.
What is, and I should have probably did this first. For people who have never heard of this, what is restraint and seclusion? Does that count like, and why do you think that these things are being hidden or at least underreported?
Yeah, so the U.S. Department of Education defines restraint as any tactic that immobilizes a child from moving their heads, arms, legs, torso freely. You can think of particular physical holds, holding a child down, holding them face up, or you can use devices like handcuffs, bungee cords, or even duct tape has been used in schools. Just imagine coming into a classroom and seeing your child duct taped to the desk. Horrific. But when we talk about why are schools hiding these things, how many parents would actually enroll their children in a school if they knew their children were actually being duct taped to a desk or placed in a jail like seclusion room for hours at a time? Most parents throughout the day, they drop their kids off in the morning. They think they're learning throughout the day. Could you imagine the horror of finding out that your child was not learning, but they had been in solitary confinement? And we know what solitary confinement does to adult inmate offenders. It does not help them. It drives them insane. They lose their minds. So why would this be any different for a child, if not more harmful and more violent? And I just can't see a scenario where a parent would willingly agree to this process, particularly in the case of a non-emergency situation.
When and why did they start doing this, and what is the kind of the rationale so some people can understand what they say is the reason for doing these seclusion and restraints?
So at the very beginning of the sort of integration of students with disabilities into public education, which is in 1975 with the Individuals with Education Disabilities Act, 1975, you had this protected space where if you had a disability, you couldn't go to school with students who did not have disabilities. There was a negotiation here where if you're going to allow students with disabilities to come into a classroom, there were people on one side of this debate arguing that you can't let them integrate into this space if we can't restrain and seclude them. So automatically thinking of students with disabilities not as just children, but as problematic, children who needed to be managed, children who are violent and needed to be controlled and regulated. So these tactics literally follow children from medical facilities into public schools. And it's only recently that we've begun to question what's actually happening, because schools have done a very good job of hiding this, not only from parents and other policymakers, but from researchers as well. There's very little research on the effects of restraint and seclusion on families. There's a lot of policy work analyzing the policies, but very few people have asked, how does restraint and seclusion impact a family?
And tell me, from your studies, what has that done to children that you have studied?
It has been absolutely devastating for them. I think at the very first element of this, children learn to trust adults. They learn this from their parents. So a parent literally walks a child to school or drives them and introduces them to their teacher. And there is a certain level of trust that is embedded in that relationship, in the parent-child relationship, that transfers over to the child-teacher relationship. Parents slowly tell their children through an informal handshake or an informal, I'm leaving you with this adult, that you can trust them. So imagine from a child's perspective that this trusted adult figure is the one that's restraining me and harming me and putting them in the seclusion room. Children interpret that as a betrayal. And it's not just a physical aspect of it, it's a psychological aspect of it that, hey, I trusted you and you did this to me. Now, in terms of the physical aspects of it, children have broken their arms, they've had their legs broken because of improper restraints, and adults have sat on them and put their full body weights on them. And then the effects of the isolation, just being in a room for an extended amount of time with no human interaction. We know what that does to people. We've studied that in Eastern Pennsylvania prison 200 years ago. We've studied this. And at that point, solitary confinement was absolutely abandoned because of the effects of it on the human mind. It's only in recent years that it's been brought back. And I think we have to question a child in a room for an extended period of time. I've interviewed families where they've told me their child was in a seclusion room for over 100 hours for a single
100.
offense. 100 hours. They're dropping their kid off at school every day, and they're thinking their children are learning, only to find out that their child has been reporting to the seclusion room, and as children have described, serving time for a single behavioral outburst in class.
There's in devil's advocate, what I've heard, and argued online and by some teachers and etc. They've said, these kids are punching the staff or they're punching teachers or they're acting out, and this is for their safety. Is there is there truth to that? And when does it cross the line from actually keeping them safe from themselves and being violence, as you call it?
Certainly. And there is truth to this. There are teachers who have been attacked by children. And there is a few reasons why this happens, one of which is triggered displaced aggression. This is a psychological concept where sometimes children are bringing trauma from home. They're bringing trauma from the environment or the community. And the teacher just happens to be the first person the child is interacting with, and they take out that frustration on the teacher. That is one incident. The other is, and I don't think school officials have admitted this publicly, and school policymakers have refused to acknowledge this, that again, this form of betrayal that manifests in the child-teacher relationship after an instance of seclusion, it literally activates children's nervous systems and fight or flight response mechanisms that if this person that I trusted is harming me by placing me in a seclusion room and dragging me there, that I need to fight back for my life because there's no one here to help me. My parent is at work. It's just me and the teacher, and I don't want to be dragged to the seclusion room. I don't want to be in this room. So after being placed in that room one or two times, what it does is it introduces trauma into children's lives. Trauma that was not there before they were restrained or secluded. And because of that traumatic experience, of course I'm fighting back. When you try to drag me, I don't want to go. So I'm kicking and screaming and I'm punching. I'm doing everything I can to make sure I don't go to that seclusion room and get locked inside. And from a teacher's perspective, that could be victimization from a child, but that's not how the child sees it. And that's not how we should look at it either. And I would encourage school staff to consider how their own actions are triggering a trauma response from children that leads to the violence, leads to the fighting and the hitting and punching and things like that would not happen if you weren't dragging these children to the seclusion room and locking them inside.
Have you seen where in your studies and looking at this, where it became adversarial between an adult and a child instead of being for its safety or etc.?
Certainly, certainly. And there's a few cases that have circulated online where, and before we even get to this, it's just really important to understand that the Department of Education tells us that seclusion and restraint should never be used as punishment. Never. It's not a punishment. This is a tactic that should be used in emergency situations where a child has a mental health crisis and is considered a danger to themselves or others. That's it. So using this as a punishment for, and which is manifested in my study, for getting out of your seat repeatedly, for singing loudly in class, for eating snow, that's not what seclusion and restraint was meant for. And I think that's really important to understand. And I've talked to lots of parents who told me they felt their children were being targeted. It became an adversarial issue where my child was getting out of their seat repeatedly because they have ADHD or autism or something like that. And the teacher's frustrated because of it. You also have instances where the teacher is undertrained. And as a response to this teacher shortage that we are dealing with nationally, many states have lowered the requirements. So now you have individuals who aren't qualified to be in these situations in classrooms with students with disabilities, and they don't have the skills to navigate that situation. So now they resort to these punitive and harmful tactics that traumatize children. And then, if you think about this from the school's perspective, they have an incentive to cover it up because they don't want to lose students and families. Schools are operating based on enrollment. Well, if a news story comes out where you have a child who's been harmed and restrained and secluded, well, the first thing that's going to happen is parents are going to withdraw their children from that school. That school loses money, and it's going to be really hard to recruit children to that school in the future. Schools know that. So they'd rather cover this up than to report it and have an investigation here statewide at the worst and nationwide in most cases.
What have you seen, because you've talked to these parents, you've studied these kids, what have you seen the long-term effects after something like being put in a, they call it ISS room, or they have different wording for it now.
Mhm.
You were talking about this. They have different wording from when, my kid was in school. But what have you seen the long-term effects, the long-term outcomes? And then especially being a criminal justice professor, you know
Mhm.
how this can become a criminal justice matter real quick.
Yes,
Can you talk,
certainly,
can you
certainly.
speak on that?
Yes, and there's a few cases where I've actually followed up with families whose children were in the seclusion rooms, and it's just absolutely tragic. Many of these children were just never able to return back to a public school again. And they are traumatized by walls, by doors closing, very similar to inmates who've been in solitary confinement or been in any carceral setting. But we have to remind ourselves that these are not inmates we're talking about. We're talking about
No.
public school children who look to us to instill the best in them and invest in them and help them become the most productive people in society. And here they are, because of tactics that have been used inappropriately in school. They're not able to go to a physical school building anymore. They are traumatized and afraid of teachers, afraid of going to school again, kicking and screaming. Parents have sent me videos of children kicking and screaming, begging their parents not to send them back to school again. And parents have described the morning routine as like WWE. They're literally fighting kids and wrestling with them to get them to go to school, and that's how they learned something had happened initially. And they're just trying to figure out, why is this still happening? Just the nightmares and the night terrors children are having after this event has happened prompted many children, many parents just refuse to send their kids back to public school, and they settle in a virtual platform or homeschool them all together.
Have you seen where this has led to actually, later on these kids being arrested or getting involved with the criminal justice system?
I've had some instances where immediately the instances of restraint and seclusion invited criminal or law enforcement activity, not necessarily long term, And I think this is really important too, because we're thinking that there may be a school to prison pipeline or a long term initiative here, but immediately, at least one student I can recall was eloping school because of this. He's leaving the building because he's so traumatized because of the repeat use of restraint and seclusion. And this student actually left, went to a neighbor's home, and was on Ring camera. And even though he went to a neighbor's house, well, the school called the police and they told them they had a mentally challenged child who was potentially dangerous with a weapon. And this
Oh my
kid was
God.
manhandled on camera, thrown to the ground, told he needed to obey the law and obey his superiors. And here he was, a 10-year-old kid with Pokemon cards.
My gosh. That is
And this
so
kid
horrible.
nightmares because of this, and asked his mom, he's shaking in her arms, please never send me back.
What I mean, and then what happens with their interactions with law enforcement for the rest of their lives? With any authority figure, you know, we function as a society in Western culture through our laws, and so it's something that we learn that we have to have some kind of respect for. But when you're early on in your life, when you're developing those things, it becomes an adversarial or scary thing, traumatic thing.
Mhm.
You know, it could be something that affects you for the rest of your life. Do you think
Certainly.
that do you think that this is a training problem or a culture problem?
I think it's both. I think it's a training problem because we have not. I think it's a culture problem that has fed into a training problem as well. It's a culture problem because we had anti-disability sentiment baked into our system as we migrated into the education space. So if you go back to FDR, the first and only president with a disability, he hid his reliance on a wheelchair out of fear that he would be scrutinized because of his disability status. And then when you look at the historical context of how people with disabilities were treated in society, you had legalized sterilization practices in many states throughout the country all the way up into the mid 1960s. Now, dates are really important here because mid 1960s is where the sterilization practices ended. For if you were in a federal facility or government run facility, you could be sterilized if you were found to have a severe cognitive impairment. That's mid 1960s that ends. The integration of students with disabilities into public schools, that's 1975. That's a decade later. What did we do? And this is a question I want the audience to really think about. What did we do to acknowledge this anti disability sentiment that had been ingrained in society and so deeply ingrained that a sitting president was so fearful of it? What conversations did we have with school staff that had resisted the integration of students with disabilities before 1975? None. So we allowed the integration of these students into a anti-disability hostile environment. And it should be no surprise that these tactics follow them into this entire space. Now, the training aspect of it manifests where we've never humanized children with disabilities to focus on their ability. We've never trained teachers and given teachers the resources to do so because you have a lot of these unfunded mandates where you're supposed to have this individual education plan that provides all the resources, but does the federal government send enough resources to actually accomplish the goal? Is there sufficient oversight to make sure that school systems and states are actually abiding by the individual's IEP? It's just an unfunded mandate for many families. I can't tell you how many families I've talked to across the country that told me that, hey, I sat down for the IEP meeting, decided that my child needed all these resources. We left the room, we had a document, and it was never followed. Nobody ever followed that document. So that becomes a problem, and that's a training issue that's built on the back of a culture issue that we've never addressed in our society.
Do you think that because, you know, I don't assign malintent to people unless I see it, you know. So there are very great teachers doing very great things in
Certainly,
special education and
certainly,
working really hard. Do you think that sometimes they fall victim to a system?
certainly. And I think you have this convergence of what we know as zero tolerance. So you had this area in the 90s where zero tolerance, uh, through the war on drugs in the 80s, public schools adopted many of these zero tolerance policies to punish students in massive numbers. And in recent years, we've sort of moved away from zero tolerance politically. But the problem is, you had lots of people who thought that they could just pass a law and get rid of zero tolerance. And they didn't realize that it's a culture. You created a culture when you allow teachers to suspend or punish students for any reasons whatsoever. That's a culture that you created. Now, if you have a public school teacher who's coming into the room and they're new, they're brand new, fresh out of school, they have no understanding of the building culture that they're getting into. So you had schools that have been punishing students, kicking them out for 30 years, restraining them and secluding them for 30 years. How do you change that as a new teacher? You can't, because you're in a system that is forcing you to either follow the rules or you're ostracized. You're removed from that system. And I think that's the issue that a lot of policymakers didn't expect or completely underestimated when they passed these laws across the country. And I think they need to really rethink how deeply rooted this culture of punishing children and kicking them out has become. I've talked to, and I've done research in some districts where the finances for the school are tied to a student via a voucher system. So the school gets $10,000 or $15,000 per student. And I've seen instances and I've heard parents and even some school staff tell me that there's this fancy count day that happens where the school gets all the money that they're going to get for the year. And then right after that, they just start kicking kids out because that's the culture that's been built and incentivized through that mechanism of funding public schools. So if you are a good teacher and you come into a building that has bad practices, then you either follow the bad practices or in most cases you leave.
Right. Do you think that, Doc, do you think that the schools that you've studied and the situations that you've seen, do you think that they were too quick to turn a manifestation into a behavioral issue and turn it into behavior problems and go straight into this is a punitive behavior thing?
I do. And I think at the very core of this issue, I don't think they ever wanted these kids, to be honest. I think that
Wow.
this is a return to what we saw pre 1975. I think that you had a lot of resistance to the integration of children with disabilities in the public schools. We've never dealt with that from a cultural standpoint. We've never addressed the anti-disability sentiment that was in mainstream society and pervaded public schools. We've never addressed it. And I think the very first paragraph in my book brings that core issue to light. And I'll describe this for you. There's a teacher who's shaking a child. Why can't you be a normal boy? That's what she's saying to him. Why can't you be a normal boy? And a parent is crying tears as she's retelling this story to me. So naturally, she goes to the school, parent does, and she asks the teacher, hey, can you calm down on this normal boy language? Why are you saying this to my child? And the teaching assistant says, point blank, we see our children going into the world doing amazing things. Unfortunately, your child will never be able to do that. And that is directly communicating to that parent that we really don't want your child here because of their disability status. And I had another parent tell me that teachers at my son's school like to brag. They like to say that the kids are going into this university or going into this occupation. And that helped me understand that schools preferred students who they felt would be a return on their investment. They wanted students who they invest in, they go into the world and become doctors, lawyers, engineers, or professional careers where they could point to that student and say, hey, that student went to our school. And absent that potential, many schools completely discarded students. They don't want to invest in them. And that's, I think, exactly what we're seeing in restraint and seclusion. And I think that rather than suspend these kids because they have so many protections through ID, I think that restraint and seclusion becomes the next strategy to encourage parents to withdraw their children. Because if you suspend kids and kick them out and they have an IEP or a 504 plan, there has to be a manifestation termination hearing. There has to be a lot of paperwork in order to kick kids out through that tactic. Rather than kick them out forcefully, if you restrain or seclude them enough, most parents are just going to withdraw and move on.
They're going to give up because they want to protect their kids, and then the school no longer has to deal with that. And I understand the importance. There's sites like greatschools.com where they get these alphabet grades for the school. The grading systems in Texas are the same way, where they come down where they're an A school or B school, etc. And when you have a high percentage of disability kids that show up to these schools, it drags those things down. And then it becomes an issue because the greater the score on that, the more apt they are to parents are to enroll their kids. Better, what would you say would be a better way that, these things could be done? How can, how could you change the culture in these schools, or change at least the training? Maybe you can't change the culture, but can you do training better?
Yes. And I think that training absent culture is bound to fail. We have to address both.
Right.
So the first thing that we need to do is we need to, as a society, as a school system, we need to address anti-disability sentiment. We need to look back historically and say that, hey, this is what happened with FDR. This is what happened with forced sterilization. This is the history here. It was harmful. It was wrong. We need to understand that restraint and seclusion is born out of solitary confinement and born out of anti-disability sentiment. And the research is very clear. There's no negotiation here. Solitary confinement for humans is psychologically harmful. If we, and this is really something that I want to emphasize too. In the federal prison system, solitary confinement is banned. You cannot put juveniles in solitary confinement in the federal prison systems. So why can you do it in public schools? If the federal government has acknowledged that solitary confinement for juvenile offenders who've committed crimes is inappropriate and far too harmful, then why is it legal for public school children? That's something I want you to think about. And I think that the training piece of this follows the culture, because once we admit that there is research to support the harms of these practices, now we can have a conversation about alternative strategies. And then we can have a conversation about working with parents. I think that we've missed a tremendous opportunity because parents have been raising their children for years before they even come to public schools. The first question that teachers and school staff should be asking is, well, how are you managing these behaviors at home? What could we do here that is mirroring what you're doing at home to make sure that they have a great educational experience? But many schools aren't even willing to work with parents. I had a parent tell me that his child was being restrained and secluded. And when I asked him what behaviors his child was engaging in that school staff thought warranted restraint and seclusion, he told me the school staff wouldn't even let him in the door to observe his child.
What?
That is deeply disturbing to me. And that shows a intentional effort to push parents aside and create a disconnect. Could you imagine not being able to come in your child's school and observe? And the school is saying, we're going to keep doing this, restraining and secluding, but we don't want you to see the behaviors. But what they do want you to do is withdraw.
Right. Now, if parents see this in their child, they see that something's wrong and they suspect that this is going on, what kind of questions should they be asking? What should they be trying to do?
Certainly, you should be trying to figure out how the school is responding to these behaviors and if there's any resources. And what's triggering the behaviors? Is it a student that's nearby? Is it the teacher doing something? Is it proximity? What is bringing on the behaviors that school officials believe warrant punishment? And how could we understand these behaviors, babe? Maybe the child is trying to communicate something that's going unheard. And I think that alternative explanations are important to consider. I also think that um, is this institution the best place for the child? I think that's a really important question. Are there individuals in this institution that are qualified to help the kids? And I encourage parents to consider that.
Wow. There's just so much to this. I mean, I could talk to you all night on this issue, but like, what is one thing that you really would like the public to know? What is one thing you think that parents are missing or people in general just don't know about that they need to know about this problem?
Yes, it's happening not only throughout the U.S., but it's happening in other countries as well. There's an international organization that's looking into restraint and seclusion in England. It's happening in a lot of different places, and you are not alone. I think the schools, they do an excellent job of isolating parents, um, making sure that they feel like their child is a problem. It's not a system, it's your child, it's their disability, it's their behaviors. And my message is that you're not alone. And I wrote this book to collect families from all around the country to show that you're not alone. This is happening in multiple different places. And I want you to look at this book and see your experience front and center. And what I always tell readers is that this isn't just a book. This is an opportunity to push back against the system. This is an opportunity for you to say, hey, I was told this was me, but when I read this narrative in the book and I read that one, and this is happening in Michigan, this is happening in Georgia and Alabama, and this is happening in California, this is happening here. It's a system because you can connect the dots and see the connections in the different states. And even in this book, the use of different language to describe seclusion and restraint. The language is very different in North Carolina than it is in Alabama and Georgia, but they're all using every other term except for seclusion and restraint. They're calling it everything in the world except for what it is. And I think that parents could really understand that and see this system. And the other thing I want parents to see is that I think there is a misconception that only poor families or even middle class families are affected. I had wealthy families who were affected by this, and families who told me they were spending $90,000 a month, $300,000 suing the school, fighting for their children not to be restrained or secluded. In many cases, they were losing because their school district was using their own tax dollars against them in the lawsuits because schools are funded by your property taxes. So this is a system that is formidable. We're talking about a formidable system. And the last point I'll say is that in the cases where parents won, many of them are forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. So they couldn't even talk to other parents who children were being restrained and secluded to help them navigate their own cases.
It's sobering. It's a sobering conversation because we're talking about children.
Children.
Children. We're not talking about, just any Joe Smo adult. We're talking about children, the most vulnerable in our society. And, some of those things that happen in restraints, and I'm not saying that there's intention bad on everybody. That's not what I'm saying. But when you look at some of these restraints and some of this stuff, if this stuff was done by a parent in the house, or this was done by anybody else, it would be a crime.
Certainly.
And if you bruised up this kid, it would be a crime. It would be a child abuse. It would be something. But it ends up being something that isn't. And because of the different protections that are afforded to school districts. I want to, because I really, and I'm maybe digging on this before I close out, talk to me about some of the most egregious stories that you ran into in your studies and some of those that ended up positive?
I think the most egregious stories, I would say, first, the young lady who spent 100 hours in the seclusion room at age 7 or 8. Yeah. I mean, 100 hours. Just sit with that one. 100 hours in your bathroom. No phones, no technology. Most people just couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. And the mental strain, a child looking for their parent, they can't get to them. They are locked in this room. They're kicking it, trying to get out. They can't get out. The panic sets in. Just imagine the feelings of betrayal that sets in. How do you ever trust that teacher again after putting you in that room? How do you ever go back to school after being in that room? And the feelings and then the guilt that some parents feel was tangible too, knowing that you sent your child to school and you didn't sign up for this. You didn't expect this to happen. But for many parents, it's just the realization I wasn't there. Parents have an obligation and they have a feeling it's internal to protect their children. And the guilt that many parents were feeling, because we're talking about children, but the effects of it did not stop with children. I think that's really important to emphasize. I had parents that were telling me they were thinking about committing suicide. And I think that was so heartbreaking for me because this issue was deeply weighing on them because they were fighting a system that was basically telling them it's seclusion or restraint or nothing. If you are not going to allow us to do this, you can just take your kid and go. And where do you go at that point? Many parents had no idea what to do. And those that had means that could fight the system, they realized the system could fight back and they could just outspend you. You spent $300,000. They had more money you have to hire attorneys. They have attorneys on retainer. It just became a very monstrous system. And I think that's where the institutionalized violence came from. This isn't just a isolated incident of restraint and seclusion. These parents are fighting a monstrous system that wouldn't let them in the door, that would call the police. I had a few families tell me they called CPS. Their children had visible bruises. They taken pictures. They called CPS. And CPS says, we don't investigate cases that happen at school. But because the school got wind that a parent had called CPS on them, the school called CPS on the parents. And now the parents are investigated by CPS. So just imagine the level of violence in that situation. And then a parent having to weigh, do I allow CPS? Do I want a risk of investigation with CPS? Or do I just want to follow the school rules and let them restrain or seclude my child? That's an impossible situation that no parent should ever be in.
It is. It is. It's something that, because those things can go, that system's a beast and it could go really bad for someone. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, but it's bad in the sense of the parents are doing anything wrong, but the system is, the system has different rules and different ways they go about things. So it can be a monster to deal with that. But I really do appreciate you doing the work on my show. I love people who live their lives to make humanity better. They spend their time trying to make humanity better. And that's something that you're doing. And you're doing it for the most vulnerable of our population, which is the kids that are special needs, that can't voice for themselves. They can't, all they could do is kick and scream or something like that. They can't really articulate that this is hurting me. You could just see the effects, but they can't articulate it. And you're spending your time doing that. And for that, I am truly grateful as a dad of a special needs child. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and sign off. I do appreciate y'all watching. Dr. Charles, thank you again for coming on.